Welcome back to another class on the laws of cooking on Shabbat. This will be part 6 of the class. Today we want to speak about spices added into hot food on Shabbat, which was on the fire. The halakha, when it comes to spices, is a little bit different when it comes to salt. If a person went ahead and he put salt, raw salt, into hot food which is on fire on Shabbat, we explained the halachot in part 5 of the shiur. However, when it comes to spices, the laws are identical to salt, but with a slight difference. Let's explain. Rav David Yosef Shlita begins and he says, Vehu adin, the same halach is going to apply. B'chol zeh, with all this, le'inyan, in regards to tavshil, a cooked dish, shenatnu letocho tavlin b'Shabbat, that you went ahead and you placed in it, into the cooked dish, spices on Shabbat. Now before we do continue, we need to understand what is Rav David Yosef Shlita saying. He's telling us over here, the same halach applies with all this in regards to tavshil, where you went ahead and you placed spices into it on Shabbat. What does that mean? And the same halach applies. That means Rav David Yosef is referring us back to the previous halakha. Now, Baruch Hashem, we have this technology over here, so we're able to do it together. If you recall, we spoke about placing salt, raw salt, into a food on Shabbat which is hot and which is on the fire. So we gave case number 1. Salt was already in the food before Shabbat. Came somebody on Shabbat and he added more salt into the hot pot. The halakha is going to say, even though it's forbidden to do that because the spices might cook since it's raw, nevertheless we're going to tell you the food is still allowed to be eaten on Shabbat, even if he did it on purpose. Now, Rabotai, watch this carefully. When Rav David Yosef Shlita tells us, Vehu adin b'chozen, the same halach is going to apply with all this in regards to tavshil, that meaning in regards to food where you went ahead and you place spices, he's referring back to the salt case. Which means to say like this: whatever law is going to be applicable to the salt case, that same law is going to be applicable to the spices case. So we're going to learn it like this. Instead of saying salt, we're going to put spices. Let's learn like this. Spices was already in the food before Shabbat. On Shabbat, someone adds more raw spices. To the hot pot. The halakha is going to state the same. Even though it's forbidden to do that because the spices might cook, nevertheless we're going to tell you the food is still allowed to be eaten on Shabbat. Now this right over here, we're going to have to erase. There is that slight difference between spices and salt. If you're dealing with raw salt, we're going to tell you, since you had salt there in the food prior to Shabbat, and nevertheless I was not allowed to go ahead and add raw salt on Shabbat because I'm cooking, still I'm going to tell you the food is allowed to be eaten on Shabbat even if I did it intentional. However, when it comes to spices, the same case, there were spices in the food prior to Shabbat, and I went and I placed that same spice into the food on Shabbat. I was not allowed to do it, but nevertheless I did it. I'm going to tell you the food is still allowed to be eaten on Shabbat. But when is that? That's only if you did it by accident. Because we're going to see that if you went ahead and you did it intentional, we're going to tell you it is correct to be stringent and not eat it on Shabbat, but rather wait until after Shabbat comes out. So that is case number 1. Case number 2. No salt was in the food before Shabbat. Now on Shabbat, someone adds raw salt for the first time into the hot pot. Now the food is considered like it was cooked on Shabbat, which is forbidden. Remember, you're having a ready-made dish. It's just, you want to just heat it up. That's all you're doing is heating it up before Shabbat. Meaning you place the hot pot, which is ready cooked, on top of open fire. And all you placed it on open fire is only because you wanted to keep it hot. That's all you were doing. But now someone came and for the first time he added salt into that pot because you didn't have salt there prior. Now we're going to tell it's as if you went ahead and you cooked that food on Shabbat, which technically was already cooked. Nevertheless, we're going to look at the whole food as if it's cooked now. We're going to tell you it is forbidden. Here we go. So the food becomes forbidden to eat on Shabbat. After Shabbat, you're allowed to go ahead and eat it. However, Rabotai, this is in regards to salt. Now, the same halacha we're going to apply to spices. No spices was in the food before Shabbat. On Shabbat, someone adds raw spices for the first time into the hot pot. Now the food is considered like it was cooked on Shabbat, which is forbidden. So the food becomes forbidden to eat on Shabbat. Now, Rabotai, that we know this, let's go back and see how short Rav David Yosef Shlita says it. Here we go. Vehu adin, the same halacha is going to apply. Which same halacha? The same halacha that we learned by the salt is going to apply in regards to a cooked dish where you went ahead and you placed spices into it on Shabbat. Shahadavar talu im haya betavshel me'oto tavlin kodem haShabbat. The whole thing is dependent on if you had in that cooked dish that same spice prior to Shabbat. So, Rabotai, watch this. Let's say I want to use the spice paprika. I don't know, I'm just taking anything. Now, you see a person, you go to somebody's house on Shabbat and you see that they're putting paprika into the food on Shabbat. Is that food allowed to be eaten or is it not allowed to be eaten? First question you have to ask the owner of the house, tell me, did you have that same paprika inside that food prior to Shabbat? If she tells you yes, then we're going to tell you what you did was wrong, do teshuvah, learn your halachot of Shabbat, but the food is allowed to be eaten on Shabbat itself. However, if I'm going to ask her, did you have that same paprika inside that food prior to Shabbat? She's going to say, no, I completely forgot. That's why I'm putting it now. Now you know that food is asur to be eaten. This is what Rav David Yosef Shuta is telling us over here. Nevertheless, Le'inyan tavlin, when you're dealing with spices, if it was intentional, knowing that it's not allowed. You knew today is Shabbat. You knew the malacha of putting raw food into hot food which is on the fire is not allowed. And still you went ahead and you did it. Nachon lahachmir. It's correct to be stringent. Shelo lechlo ad mochi Shabbat. That you shouldn't eat it until after Shabbat. Now, Rabotai, this word nachon, it means correct. Lahachmir means correct to be stringent. Now, so in your mind, you're going to understand that means it's only correct to be stringent. But if I want to be lenient, I could eat it on Shabbat. That is the way how the halacha comes out, which is in reality correct. But Rav David Yosef is telling you, nevertheless, it is correct to be stringent. If there's nothing else that is pushing you to eat the food on Shabbat, leave it for after Shabbat. So that is the difference between spices and salt. By salt, if it was done intentional, and there was salt prior to Shabbat in that food, we're going to tell you allowed to go ahead and eat that food on Shabbat. By spices, if you had that same spice and you went ahead and you added it on Shabbat, but you did it intentionally, we're going to tell you it's correct to be stringent and eat it after Shabbat. Nevertheless, but if it was done by accident, we're going to allow you to go ahead and eat it on Shabbat itself. Today's topic, Rabotai, adding spices or salt to cooked food on Shabbat. Case number 1. You added a spice on Shabbat. What's going to be the halacha? Are you allowed to eat it or not? If that same spice, Rabotai, this is very important. If that same spice was already in the food before Shabbat, it's okay. We're going to tell you allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to eat that food on Shabbat. However, but if it was added on purpose, which means bemazed on Shabbat, it's better not to eat it until after Shabbat, even if it's a spice that was already in there.